Kalispera from Athens, Kalimera in the United States. Welcome to yet another session of CYA's virtual lecture series, where we continue to explore and celebrate the diverse facets of knowledge and culture. And I was just telling our director backstage that if it wasn't for my colleague, Billy Simopoulos, these lectures would not be taking place. So I want to thank him on behalf of all of us. Today's lecture speaks of our commitment to present fascinating stories that bridge the past with the present. Our lecture title is Writing a Woman's Life, Eva Palmer Sikelianos. We are privileged to have Professor Artemis Leontis, an expert in modern Greek studies, to guide us through the intricate layers of Eva Palmer Sikelianos' life, a multifaceted figure who made a great contribution to the revival of ancient Greek spirit in the period between the two world wars. Artemis will speak about her latest book, Eva Palmer Sikelianos, A Life of Ruins. I don't know if you can see the book. Well, I can see it, or maybe you can. Somehow it doesn't work out this way. Let me see. Well, anyway, the lecture will delve into Eva Palmer's life from her marriage with the Greek poet Angelos Sikelianos, their collaboration in organizing the Delphic Festivals, to the complexities of her unconventional life. I will quote from the inside cover of her book, which says, drawing on hundreds of newly discovered letters and featuring many previously unpublished photographs, this biography vividly recreates the unforgettable story of a remarkable nonconformist whom one contemporary described as the only ancient Greek I ever knew. So, Artemis Leontis holds the C.P. Cavafy Professorship in Modern Greek and Comparative Literature, endowed by the Foundation for Modern Greek Studies, and directs the Modern Greek program in the University of Michigan. She received her liberal arts training with majors in religious studies and studio art at Oberlin College, and her postgraduate training in classical languages and literature and modern Greek at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and at the Ohio State University. She has received fellowships from the Greek Department of Foreign Affairs, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the University of Michigan Humanities Institute. Her field of specialization is modern Greek studies, the study of Greeks, the Greek language, migration in and out of Greece by various ethnic groups, and the idea of Greece cultivated in the West in the modern period. Leontis writes, teaches, and speaks on aspects of Hellenism in modernity, from modern Greek language, literature, culture, to graffiti, to Greek myth, and to Greek myth in film. She's also the new editor of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies Association. And last but not least of her duties is that she is on our CYA's board of advisors. Adding depth to our to this discussion today will be Professor Nina Papathanasopoulou, a Greek theater and classical mythology specialist. Nina Papathanasopoulou specializes in Greek theater. She will act today as the discussant of this event. And she specializes, as I said, in classical mythology and their reception rather. She joined the classics faculty at College here in Athens in 2020, and her academic research centers on Greek drama and on Martha Graham's dance interpretations of Greek myth. She earned her BA in classics from the University of Athens, her PhD from Columbia, and In 2013, 2019, she was visiting assistant professor of classics at Connecticut College. In 2022, Nina started producing a series of public presentations on Graham and on Greek mythology that integrate engaging talks, classical philology, and live dance. The series, titled Martha, Graham, and Greek Myth, aims to bring Nina's academic research to the public at large. Since 2019, Nina has also works as the public engagement coordinator for the Society for Classical Studies, where she oversees their classics outreach initiative called Ancient World, Modern Communities. With these words, for both our speakers, I will pass the floor to Nina for her duties. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Philaktopoulos, for that really wonderful introduction. I'd like to welcome Professor Artemis Leontis to our virtual series today as well. I'm very delighted to hear her speak today about Eva Palmer Sikelianos. I am particularly interested myself in Eva Palmer because, as Mr. Philaktopoulos said, she was a nonconformist woman, just like Martha Graham, that I'm particularly interested in, and she was fascinated by ancient Greek culture. She was so fascinated by Greek culture that she was actually fascinated by Greek lyric poetry, by Greek drama, by Byzantine music, by sort of different facets of that culture. And I'm very excited to hear what Professor Leontis wants to focus on and talk to us about today. I'd like to say that during the talk, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to write them in the chat. And then at the end of Professor Leontis' presentation, I will be reading the questions from the chat and facilitating a conversation between our audience and Professor Leontis. So please, do keep notes, be engaged and write your questions in the chat, and then we'll be delighted to hear what you have to say and discuss whatever you'd like to afterwards. So Professor Leontis, I'll pass the mic to you, and we're very excited to hear your lecture.
So welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar today. And my very special thanks to Executive Chair Alexis Philaktopoulos for his kind invitation, also to Vasilis Simopoulos for setting up the webinar, and to Dr. Nina Papathanasopoulou as a scholar whose work I've been admiring for a long time. And I'll say something a little bit more about that just at the end of my talk. I also want to make a special point about the work of CYA because it actually connects with what I'm going to be talking about. It's not just that many of the students whom I have taught and sent from U of M to CYA have received a quality education and study abroad experiences as undergraduates, but also that they have some similarities to Eva Palmer Sikelianos, though 130 years later, and with all the variation that young people offer. They arrive young. They carry with them some notion of Greece as an ancient country of ideas, but also a place for the body and the senses, a place where they may experience the world differently. And coming into contact with Greece, they may actually experience the shock and sometimes even the awe of interacting with living people and things in a country which they associate very iconically with ruins of the past, and with the fact that they are learning from people and a place that has a mind of its own. So thank you to CYA for that type of experience. I have actually seen students return and feel quite transformed. And so I think that this is a nice segue into thinking about the place of Eva Palmer Sikelianos in modern Greek culture, in transnational culture, and how you actually write the life of a woman, a minority in her non-heteronormativity, and also a person who influenced culture in different places. I want to say that my practice as a critic and scholar researching Greece during the past 4 decades has been structured by a set of themes that relate to these types of encounters. Greeks' literary and artistic self-representation in the modern period, their efforts through a reassessment of tradition to resolve certain long-standing tensions in the identity of modern Greeks between their self-recognition as descendants of medieval Romans, Byzantines, Orthodox Christians, Romi, and the aspiration to be recognized as descendants of the ancient Greeks or Hellenes. Their encounter with travelers and Philhellenes from the European West, and the circulation of their works and ideas in the West. I'm also attentive to the Western travelers to Greece, their writing and practices, their attachments to ancient Greek writing and ancient Greek sites, their relationships to classics and classicism, and to their predecessors who traveled to Greece and shaped their journey as a classical one. Their observation of contemporary life in Greece, their relationship to nationalism, their relationship to the formation of structures of imperial dominance, and their resistance to such dominance. Moving between the work of Greek intellectuals and artists on the one hand and Western travelers on the other, I was bound to run across the American Eva Palmer Sikelianos, one of the most remarkable Westerners ever to set foot in Greece. She had been prominent in her lifetime. Actually, I knew her from my childhood, from articles in which I'm going to turn on my slides, and I'm not going to be able to see you at this point, but I'm going to share on my screen where you can see my slides. I knew her from my childhood, from articles in which she lurked as a kind of shadow behind Angelos Sikelianos. As a researcher, I began to find her name and stories about her in varied types of stories, and I held on to some fascinating anecdotes. For example, newspapers reported rumors of her engagement in 1894 at the age of 20 to George Vanderbilt, one of the world's richest men in the Gilded Age, and her invitation with her mother to visit him at his palatial home in Biltmore while it was being built. Mother and daughter went, and the newspaper reporters waited for an announcement of the engagement. But when they left, there was no engagement. Later, I would read in her private letters to Natalie Barney that she walked away from the offer because she found Vanderbilt's lips too thick to kiss. There were other charming stories of how she traveled to Greece for the first time with just one handmade tunic inspired by ancient Greek sculptures and sandals on her feet, and how Athenians who encountered her in the streets gawked and laughed and even challenged her choice of dress. When she wore this same type of dress over her uncorseted body a few months later on an ocean liner traveling from France to New York to introduce her family to Angelos Sikelianos, her Greek-clad presence, startling in a breeze, added to the gaiety of the voyage for other passengers of the ocean liner, La Lorraine. Then, when she landed in New York and walked up Fifth Avenue, she created a sensation again, and especially when she disappeared a few days later in Bar Harbor, Maine, and then emerged from a private wedding at her parents' summer home, married to Angelos Sikelianos, and left the US to live in Greece for the next quarter century. Equally captivating, but more tragic, was her return to the US in 1933, now broke and at the mercy of friends to offer her housing, and then nearly 2 decades later, her return to Greece after being denied a visa for the Return to Greece tourist campaign, and her death in the Evangelismos hospital a few weeks later. After reading Upward Panic, Eva Palmer Sikelianos' own book about her ideas and her life, published posthumously in 1992 in Greek translation and in 1993 in English, and the collection of letters of Eva Palmer to Natalie Clifford Barney, her lover of her youth, published by Leah Papathanasopoulou in Greek translation, I was able to piece together a larger story. I recognized that Eva Palmer Sikelianos was at or near the center of important cultural circles and events of the first half of the 20th century in New York, Paris, and especially Greece. Circles and people who sought to inspire revive ancient Greek writings and practices in a way to remake modern Western society. The germ of the idea of my book lay here. Let's take a moment to rehearse the longer story. She was homeschooled and became a student at Bryn Mawr College in her early 20s after passing a strenuous exam specifically to enter rigorous studies in ancient Greek and to develop her skills in staging classical theater, including Shakespeare. Suspended 2 years later for doing something in the dorms that was strictly forbidden, she never completed her studies. Instead, in the early 1900s, she moved to Paris and became a major player and in an important lesbian circle in Paris, which, through its performance innovations and revisionary readings of Sappho, turned Sappho into a cult figure and contributed to gay and lesbian reappraisals of the Greek past. From 1906 to the end of her life, she practiced weaving following the methods of village women in Greece and fashioned herself every day in a Greek style that was entirely her own. In the 1920s, she advocated unsuccessfully for women to take a leading role in making Greece self-reliant and economically independent after the model of Gandhi in India by rejecting Western fashions and making weaving a necessary part of their everyday habits and a tool for creatively dressing themselves and building home industries in Greece. She taught Yanis Tsarouchis to weave in 1931 and supported a collaboration with him, Eli Papadimitriou, and others to create the small-scale enterprise for distributing and selling Greek homemade products, which was known as Ellinikes Technes. Concurrently, she studied Byzantine music, taught Byzantine music theory, and advocated for the preservation, collection, and promotion of non-Western sacred and secular music in Greece and the Middle East. A large pipe organ and two smaller ones named for her, the Evion Panharmonion, records from the School of Byzantine Music where she taught, her lectures, letters, and photographs remain from her collaboration with three subaltern musicians, Penelope Sikelianos, Konstantinos Tsakos, and Khorshid Naroji, and her patronage of non-Western traditions of music making to stave off the European instruments and sounds that were invading Greece. In 1927 and 1930, she staged two Delphic Festivals in collaboration with a group of mainly women, and I will come back to that point. Her direction of the chorus of ancient drama followed the template that she had first tested in her Sapphic circles in the US and Paris, and then developed the tools for during her stay in Greece: hand-woven costumes, non-Western Greek music, gestures from Greek vases, dance rhythms, and steps drawn from traditional practices. Performances of dance and music, and especially the large exhibition of handwork, were important features of the Delphic Festivals. She spent all her money on the festivals. She then returned to the United States in the in 1933, leaving behind two mortgaged houses, unpaid debts, a dysfunctional marriage, and deep concerns about how Angelos would survive, though his recurring message to her was for her to send him money. Meanwhile, she had no money of her own and no home, and had to rely on friends to house her for the remaining years of her life. She staged Greek plays at Smith College and Bryn Mawr, hoping to make a living. Then collaborated with dancer and choreographer Ted Shawn to produce scenes from Aeschylus's Persians and costumes for his work. Then she published a Greek translation of a major poem, Angelos Sikelianos' Akritika, with assistance from George Seferis, a really interesting chapter of her life. And with the end of World War II, she began to write letters, thousands of letters to politicians and editors against American intervention in Greece during the Cold War, and was blacklisted for this by the House Un-American Activities Committee. She returned to Greece after Angelos Sikelianos' death in 1951 and was buried at Delphi. The bare skeleton of this life inspired me with a sense of Eva Palmer Sikelianos' spirit of defiance against conventions in all areas of modern life and my research interests. But it wasn't the charm of the anecdotes or the eccentricity of the life that convinced me to write her life story. Rather, it was her persistent absence from modern Greek scholarship, except as the wife of Angelos Sikelianos, despite the fact that she was involved in substantive ways in many circles and contributed to the cultural life of Greece for nearly half a century. There have been obvious gender asymmetries in the writing of literary and cultural histories of Greece. Still, the silence around Eva Palmer Sikelianos was especially resounding. My interest developed into a decision to rewrite parts of Greek cultural history in the first half of the 20th century from an angle that placed Eva Palmer Sikelianos, her engagements with different artistic media, her relationships with many creative people at its center. The most important question I faced was how to write this life story. So I've spoken extensively in various venues about the importance of changing the perspective of familiar stories by looking at history differently and placing its missing female actors in the center. And we can certainly take this up later in our conversation, but for the remainder of my presentation, I wish to focus not so much on this why as on the how to write a woman's story back into history, which I consider to be a really important question. How do we write a woman's life? And so at this point, I will move briefly through the theoretical questions surrounding women's biography, and then I will discuss the choices I made about how to write Eva Palmer Sikelianos' life. And finally, I will answer with some questions that are lingering in my mind, and which we may be able to take up in this conversation. The theoretical grounding of my book lies in feminist history and the problem it identifies in biography. Women's biography is a genre that flourished in American first-wave feminism of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and again in second-wave feminism in the 1960s and early 1970s. Noticing the marginal position and indeed lack of women in history, women in the feminist movement wrote histories and especially biographies of women to recount their forgotten contributions. As women's studies began to enter the academy, historians of women observed that biography is a particular genre with a particular history that makes it problematic for recounting the lives of women. It is an ancient form that follows the rules of historical writing, using historical narrative techniques and reference to historical facts, so as to chronicle the great works of mostly prominent men, their successes and failures in a male-dominated world. The purpose of feminist biography, I'm going to put a slide here of the various archives that I looked at so that you can have a look at them while I'm talking. So the purpose of early feminist biography was to bring to light the lives of important women and demonstrate how brilliant their work was, despite operating on the margins outside of power. The works of that era constituted the material of women's history and contributed to the creation of women's studies in American universities during the end of second-wave feminism. But as Bothiti Khadzarullah has very aptly observed in her article, Historiographic Approaches to Gender, the stories and biographies of women were often left on the sidelines. The integration of women in the context of existing historiographical production did not change the marginal position of women in history either. But above all, it did not cause any tremor in the historiographical traditions that were responsible for the marginalization of women and their history. The reevaluation of women's studies that followed in the early 1990s brought great changes. Very important was the integration of gender studies into women's studies. Having a definition and studies in all areas of research. In several discussions, critical discourse was heard on the Western-centric bias of women's studies and on the immediate need to expand the scholarly space to connect the study of gender in America with the study of women, gender, sexuality, the body, race, and colonialism around the world, and to recognize the multiplicity of experiences of discrimination, marginalization, exploitation, and violence that intersected. The study of women and gender should open new discussions and hitherto unknown paths. This is still expected today. The critical appraisal of women's studies also raised questions about the appropriateness of methods of research and narrative, particularly in biography. It should be noted that although criticism of biography cuts deep and offers no easy solutions, the genre of biography does not disappear, but continues in traditional ways and also in new forms. It is a very elastic type of writing with a narrative grace that is not easily sacrificed. So these two things are in tension with each other, and we can't really give up either one of them. The questions about biography focus on the study of the subject of study, the narrative and the uses of sources, and in particular the questions, what is the choice of subject, how does the narrative flow, and how are research perspectives represented. So I'll take each one of these, and then I'm going to look at how I faced them and what solutions I found in my writing. So choice of subject. 20th century writing of women's biography tended to focus on unique, distinguishing women. Such biographies chronicled their great works, insisted on their uniqueness, and traced the successes of women in male spaces. But they raised a lot of questions. How do these biographies of women differ from biographies of men? What do they offer to the social issue of gender equality? Could biographies be written of less known women or groups of women who engaged in issues of everyday life? Narrative flow. How should a story be told? Biographies tend to present a linear narrative from life to death that passes through certain stages: family, upbringing, education, work, love between women and men, marriage, birth and upbringing of children, spiritual cultivation, the great body of work, old age, and death. This ordinary course is defined by patriarchal society and does not lead nor does it recognize the possibility of other roles in society or of contributions that cannot fit into this narrative arc, which in any case doesn't represent the way we live our lives. And third, perspective, voice, and distance of the researcher in relation to the topic and tracing of sources. How can biographical narrative attend to the relationships of the narrative of the person whom it is tracing and putting into order the remains of the life in a biography? The sources of biography are even more inadequate and their relationship to life more problematic than the sources of history. Objects are thrown, scattered, and lost, or picked up by trusted persons to erase what was socially undesirable. Women's sources are even harder to find than men's because women changed their surname. How can the discourse of life make visible the paths of research and give voice to the feelings and questions of the researcher? Okay, now I'm back to thinking about Eva Palmer Sikelianos' life, and I am putting in front of you the table of contents of my book, which I will work through. In writing this book, I found inspiration in each of the challenges that I've just laid out. I worked through them to establish a set of principles at the outset. Then slowly, while delving deep into the book's research, I developed organizational and writing strategies in accordance with these principles, with an aim to produce a book that would both fill some gaping holes and simultaneously open itself to multiple ways of reading and finding new paths of investigation. So you can see in the table of contents that there are 5 chapters at the center: Sapphic performances, weaving, patron of Byzantine music, drama, and writing. So those are the numbered chapters, and each of them has a word that relates to a medium in which Eva Palmer Sikelianos was working. And these are framed then by the front matter and the back matter. The front matter includes a chronology, and the back matter includes, of course, the notes and the references and an index. We also had illustrations, acknowledgements, and an introduction and an epilogue, which are framing devices for the entire story. So I'm going to talk about these different elements. So one principle that I responded to was the question that women, that responded to the question of how women's and gender studies asks us to choose our subjects. So one of the ways that I responded to this was to give the narrative focus to a non-heteronormative life and her difficult path, indeed very difficult, in relation to points defined by patriarchy, her broken engagement, her education that was not completed, her love of women, her trip to Greece, what we could call a white marriage, although it produced a child, specialization in weaving, her alternative dress, her attachment to Byzantine music, and she called Byzantine notation queer notation, very different use of the word queer than we use it today, but it's the one place where it appears in her work. Her major work at the Delphic Festivals, which was accredited to Angelos Sikelianos, her bankruptcy and return to America, her politicization and persecution, and then her death in Greece. I did not organize the book in small chapters that follow one another chronologically, as is the custom in many biographies. Instead, I identified 5 chapters that each chronicle Eva Palmer Sikelianos' relationship with an artistic genre, as I pointed out, and genre or medium, and with a group of people that she encountered or gathered while doing this work. Each of the chapters required different specialized knowledge, research in different libraries and archives, learning about this specialized knowledge, and writing about it. And indeed, I would say that the chapter that's on music could have stood as a could have stood as a book on its own. In laying out the story, I found also that sometimes Eva Palmer Sikelianos had to disappear as other people emerged at the center, and then she would reemerge. So she's not the center of the story at all times. In the chapter on drama, for example, which recounts successive attempts by different groups to stage ancient drama before it turns its attention to Delphi, Eva Sikelianou is absent for more than half of it. And I would welcome discussion of this or any other chapter in our ensuing conversation. All right, that's the first principle. The second principle is that the narrative has many starting points and flows differently in each form. All right, so each chapter, so we have various entries, various kinds of narrative in the book. The chapters, which begin with Eva Palmer at a young age, but not as a child. She's 26 years old. And they tell her long story until she reaches her death. But the narrative goes in circles. Each chapter covers a large part of her life, but the chapters overlap. Framing the chapters is the introduction and epilogue, which is another entrance into the narrative. The broader frame is the chronology, and I'm going to talk about the introduction and the epilogue momentarily. But the broader frame is the chronology, which I put together to tell the bare bones story in chronological order, and then there is a list of characters at the end of the book, which explains who they are. And I want to say that even the notes and the references tell a story of my own path of research. So multiple entries into the narrative and multiple forms of narrative. That's the second principle. And the third principle is that the book contains the history of the tracing of records and objects upon which the narrative of the life story is based. So it is also an archival story and a story about archiving. In the introduction, I described my discoveries that led to finding the key that allowed me to make sense of Eva Palmer Sikelianos' attachment to Greece and to ancient Greek dress. This then led me to the Center for Asia Minor Studies, where, with the necessary and very generous help from Ioana Petropoulou, I was given access to strictly inaccessible material, and I'll say something more about this momentarily. In this archive, I also discovered other secrets about Eva Palmer Sikelianos, both during her life and after her death. In the historical archives of the Benaki Museum, I met other people and made other discoveries about the posthumous collecting and organization of the materials. So this principle of the book containing the history of the tracing of records is perhaps the most important one for this book, because it provides transparency in my working method and how I draw my conclusions. It is also the one that raised the questions that I am going to work through now. And I'm near the end of my talk, so I just want you to know where I am. Lingering questions that have emerged from my research. These are particularly clustered around my engagement with archival records and objects that were strictly inaccessible at the Center for Asia Minor Studies. A center, I want to underscore, whose research scope has no apparent relationship to the life and work of Eva Palmer Sikelianos. What does the Center for Asia Minor Studies have to do with Eva Palmer Sikelianos? She never worked there, and she never had anything to do with the study of Asia Minor. So a few words about my relationship, a few more words about my relationship to this material. In 2009, I gained access to the two boxes that you see here. They were materials identified as the papers of Eva Sikelianou. This collection was one of the most important for writing the books, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to acknowledge the support not only of Ioana Petropoulou, who was then a researcher at the Center for Asia Minor Studies, but also of Stavros Anastidis, the acting director in 2009, who gave me my initial access. And then in 2016, the board of the Center for Asia Minor Studies, which voted to open these materials formally to me so that I could cite them in my book, and also appointed me without my asking and without, I felt, my right to refuse, to organize, digitize, and open the archive. And I have been working on that very, very large project since that time. I learned later that the now late and deeply mourned Marcos Dragumis was especially supportive of the board's decision and actually advocated for it. I also want to acknowledge Director Professor Paschalis Kitromilidis, who oversaw the process, and express my gratitude to all these people and also to the people who work in the archive and have helped me in the archiving work that I've been doing. Without them, I would never have written or published this book. So, and here you can see some of the stacks of letters. My research for the book was a trove of personal letters in two boxes. This is just a few of them. There were 623 of them. Almost all of them written between 1900 and 1909, the largest number comprising the two-sided love correspondence of Eva Palmer and Natalie Barney, but also with a good number of letters from other women who were Eva Palmer's lover and showed that her stance was one of polyamorousness. There were also a significant number of letters from Eva Palmer's family. Here's a list, I think, of the materials. Family members, and 14 letters exchanged between Octave Merlier, who was the director of the center in 1969 and 1970 when the letters were collected. So letters between Octave Merlier and Natalie Clifford Barney about Merlier's access to the correspondence, given to him when he visited Barney in 1969, when she was near the end of her life. These letters entered part of a larger archive of Eva Palmer Sikelianos that he was creating, as I would soon discover. A slightly larger stack of the same collection remained in Natalie Barney's home and was later relocated to her archive in the Jacques Doucet Library at the University of Sorbonne. The materials in the two libraries, the Center for Asia Minor Studies and Jacques Doucet, helped me to plot out connections between Eva Palmer's creative work from Paris and then how it carried over into Athens and to Delphi. They became the source text supporting two big chapters and key arguments running through the entire book. They introduced me to Eva Palmer's early interests in Greek music, which I was able to connect with ethnographic work of Konstantinos Psakhos that she supported in the teens. And they also helped me to plot major turning points of the disappearance of the collection, which had been randomly separated from the mirroring collection in Paris. The entire collection, its different parts, and I'm just going to show you a few pictures from it. Its complex archival history are significant as a piece of early 20th century history of modern lesbianism at the intersection with classicism and also with modern Greece. Here's a telegram that Natalie Barney sent her just after she married, or that she sent to Natalie Barney just after she married Angelos Sikelianos, telling her that she wasn't able to do whatever it was that Barney was asking her. And finally, I want to leave this slide on as I come to the end of my talk. And here what we're seeing is the red hair of Eva Sikelianos, which she cut a tuft of it just around when she was around 32 years old, when she broke up with Natalie Barney, and she put it in a box with photographs. And as we know, hair, when it's cut, retains its color. And so here we have really a piece of her, it's a human remains that is reflective of the moment in 1932 when she broke up with Natalie Barney. And I want to say that this tuft of hair is now in the Angelos Sikelianos Museum in Lefkas, and that it really doesn't belong there because it had nothing to do with Angelos Sikelianos. It was never given to him. And in fact, he never saw the box of hair. It came to the Center for Asia Minor Studies in 1969 and now is on loan in the Angelos Sikelianos Museum. So I'm not protesting, I'm just saying that it doesn't belong. So as I said, I want to point to the dissonance that marks this collection in the Center for Asia Minor Studies. And I want to say that dissonance is actually a very productive thing and that we should not ignore it. It shouldn't be pushed away. It is something that we need to pay attention to. Paradoxically, it is dissonant that points not only to things not belonging, but that there may be important ties that we have not yet fully explored. So there's so many questions about why this collection is in the Center for Asia Minor Studies. Why did Barney let Merlia take it? Why did Merlia keep it? Why did the center keep it? Why didn't they throw it away? Why didn't they return it? You know, of course, why did it remain hidden? But then also, why was it opened when it was opened? So I'm now near the end of the talk, and I want to use this end to indicate some of the openings for new lines of research that follow from my work. Together with the intimate love letters and family correspondence of Eva Palmer Sikelianos from 1900 to 1909, I discovered, when the archive was opened, that there are 12 more boxes of materials from the life of Eva Palmer Sikelianos in the Center for Asia Minor Studies. And although I have organized and documented the first 2 boxes, I have only very, very quickly moved through those other 12 boxes. It's an enormous amount of material. These 2 were hidden and strictly inaccessible until the archive was opened for my research, and I've only begun to go through them, as I said. They indicate a deep relationship, not only of Octave Merlier with Eva Palmer Sikelianos, but especially of Melpo Merlier, who was an ethnomusicologist and who was studying at the Sorbonne University in Paris in 1924, exactly at the time when Eva Sikelianos visited Paris and saw again her friend Natalie Barney while she was waiting for the Evian Panharmonion to be completed in Germany, and where she met Khorshid Nauroji, the Parsi musician from an eminent family of Mumbai, who was also a student of ethnomusicology and music at the Sorbonne. And so this points to a contact that was probably made at that time. Merliet had not lived in Greece before then. She moved to Greece after that with Merliet. And when she moved to Greece, she began her important ethnomusicological work, the project that Marcos Dragoumis oversaw at the Center for Asian Minor Studies, and what is, I think, really a core collection there. And this work deeply interested Eva Sikelianos. Eva Palmer Sikelianos' collections with people associated with the Center for Asian Minor Studies do not end there. Eli Papadimitriou, whose life story was recently published in a brilliant book by Ioana Petropoulou, was one of Eva Palmer Sikelianos' collaborators at the Delphic Festival. The two women were also involved, together with Tsarouchis and others, in the enterprise for distributing and selling handmade Greek products, Ellinikes Technes, which opened in 1931. It was a briefly run. Eli Papadimitriou put a lot of money into it, and actually the financial records show that Eva Sikelianos was also putting money into it exactly at a time when she was also bankrupt. So the lines of connection between these two women, Eli Papadimitriou, also someone who was anti-conventional, eccentric, who was extremely generous and perhaps naive in the way that she gave her money, and who, like Eva Sikelianos, turned leftist in the decades to come, have barely been touched upon. And I do want to say that Ioana Petropoulou does touch on them in her marvelous biography. I also want to mention important work that is in progress on women's labor in Greece after 1922 by Zizi Saliba, an economic historian, who is paying special attention to this collection, to the collective that worked for Ellinikes Technes. There are lines of connection that are not fully sketched out too between Eva Palmer Sikelianos and Angeliki Hatzimichali, and also a larger group of women. These women, as Alexandra Tutunzi noted in a conversation with me and suggests in her very important dissertation, η Αγγελική Χατζημιχάλη ως εθνική λαογράφος, η απόδειξη της λαϊκής τέχνης ως συστατικού στοιχείου του νεοελληνικού πολιτισμού, were the ones who should have received credit for giving artistic shape to and organizing the Delphic Festivals, not Angelos Sikelianos. My hope in writing the life of Eva Palmer Sikelianos is that the book is not the final word, but an opening to new avenues of archival practices and research which prioritize vulnerable materials, turn the lens on women and other marginal groups in Greece, not just for their outstanding work, but especially for their collective imagining of a world that might be otherwise. So in closing, I would like to say, again, just how happy I am that Dr. Nina Papathanasopoulou is going to be in conversation with me, and to mention that her blog, Classics Everywhere, which ran on the SCS website a few years ago, was really great, and I read it, and I really enjoyed it, especially during the pandemic. And it also appeared just about the time that my book appeared, and I felt that there were some important synergies between the two projects. I want to thank everybody again for listening to what I hope was not too dense presentation, and to say that I'm very excited about the conversation that will follow.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Leontis. That was very interesting and informative. And we already have some questions from the audience. Let me just first say that I thought, everything that you said about sort of your methodology and the way that you treated, looking into the life of Eva Palmer was, I think, again, very interesting. And, I think you brought to our attention sort of the difficulties in undertaking such a project and sort of figuring out, what in the life of a woman you want to look at, And I thought that, you saying that you wanted to look at this sort of not chronologically, but sort of choose particular subjects and delve into them was very interesting. And I think it was also interesting, sort of all the discussion that you have about the archives. I myself, sort of having worked with Martha Graham, know how difficult it is to sort of get access to many of these things. So it doesn't, come without a lot of hard work. And it's, particularly interesting for you to say that, you only looked at like 2 boxes when there were like 12 in the center, right? So who knows how much more, is out there, right? That people would be interested in, that would sort of maybe even change sort of the way that we think of Eva Palmer, right? If we had access to all of that other material as well. So I think that all of that was sort of super informative. I think that, it would be best perhaps if I start looking at some of the questions that the audience has for us. And then, maybe I'll weave in some of my own questions as well, if I think that's okay with everybody. So one person actually says that, Laura Jensen, she says that the history of writing this biography is simultaneously a history of you as a researcher of Eva Palmer Sikelianos. And maybe you want to expand a little bit about that. And I think that's, particularly interesting because, as she says, the way that you approach the subject in some ways becomes then of interest in and of itself, right? And then we're looking into sort of your way of dealing with the whole issue. And so she's saying, if you can expand a little bit about that, about writing oneself in a way through one's research. So in some ways, by looking into this project, it's as if you're thinking about your own self and your own values, what you're interested in. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that.
So I started researching the book in 2007, and I published it in 2019. And that's 12 years. And they were, of course, very important years in Greece, where in 2007, Greece seemed to be sitting very nicely and economically in a happy place. And then, of course, things changed there. But I also want to say that socially, a lot of things came to our attention. And so in 12 years, you enter a river in one place, and it's not the same river when you come out of it. I mean, I was very, very transformed by the research that I did. I started writing a very different book from the one I ended up writing. And I had a very strong sense that I needed to follow certain leads and of the importance of exploring the lesbian, the sapphic, the queer, whatever we want to call it, that archive. People told me not to do it, and that this was not relevant or it was too personal. And yet there is, I think, no way to get to the most important thing artistically, which was, where did these ideas about Greece, what was the path that her own ideas of Greece followed? And then the personal dimensions, which are so painful to read, really changed my way of thinking about how public and how important how the public dimension of sexuality is very important for people who are living their lives. So that was just one way in which I was transformed. I also developed really good walking feet because I had to walk to the archival, the historical archives of the Benaki Museum from the train that I took every time I went up there. And I learned to work really quickly in archives. My handwriting was completely twisted and destroyed. Those are some of the things, but I really came out of this project thinking about Hellenism in a very different way.
Great, thank you. Another question comes from Barbara Stetson, who asks, what was the most interesting thing you learned about Eva during your research? I know these are hard questions, right? Because how can you judge sort of?
There's so many things. One was that she studied opera, she was an opera singer. And she was planning to sing. All of this was very amateurish in the sense that she wasn't ever planning to make money on it. And she was a lover of Emma Calvé, one of the great divas of her time. So there's just there's so many details. I'm not sure that there's any one. I can say that that writing the last chapter, which was on writing, was the one that I enjoyed the most. It just kind of came more easily than any of the others, but it was the one moment when, because of her poverty, I felt like there was a level of awareness that she now had. She was always a little bit inflexible and difficult, I think, but there was, but a generous person underneath. And through poverty, she became aware of power relations in a way that she hadn't been thinking about before. And so that just really digging deep into that moment when she is essentially homeless was something that touched me very deeply.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask something as well. I was just wondering, there's all these women, especially at the beginning, I think, of the 20th century, that turned their attention to Greece and that are fascinated sort of by different aspects of ancient Greek culture. And I think, so, obviously each of them do them for different reasons, right? And there's different things that really attract them in ancient Greece. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about, sort of, if you think there was a particular sort of purpose that Eva had, that maybe that you found through your research. Like, did she want to sort of spread awareness of ancient Greek culture to everybody? Was she just fascinated by it and sort of it fed into her own, satisfaction, let's say? Did she take aspects of Greek culture to understand better her own times, like, let's say the US, or the relationship between the US and Greece? Like, I think, obviously there's different ways in which we can approach this, but maybe you can say a little bit about that.
If this was a multiple
Yes, sorry.
question, I would say all of the above. I think at different times, at different moments, it was different things. Everything always would turn back on her experience of being a person in the modern world, and the alienation that she felt. I think there was pretty deep alienation, but also, she also felt a connection, which when she came to Greece, she felt that she had come into a world that was quickly transforming, quickly changing. And I mean, in a way, she was anti-modernist. She was wanting to hold on to things that were going away, but it wasn't just everything. She was particularly interested in the erasure of culture that was happening, and wanted to preserve it. So I mean, and I think that the focal point kind of shifts. At first, it's all about the ancients. It's that dead culture and the fragmented culture that, in a way, you could put yourself into in any way and turn into what you want it to be. And then she's interested in the connection of modern Greek culture to ancient Greek culture to make those links. But by the end of her life, her passionate interest is, what is the world going to look like in the Cold War? What is the world going to look like, and what is going to happen to small countries or to countries that don't have the same amount of power as other countries? So it's very much a multiple choice, all of the above answer.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Donna Sadler. Do you think she was performing her identification with Greece in her love of weaving? Shades of Penelope, she says.
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. She was performing so many different things. I think that's a really wonderful way of putting it. Thank you.
And then Theodora Patrona.
And actually, if there was one slide, there's one slide, it's a pretty famous picture of her where she is, she's crossed her legs. She was wearing this fabulous dress, which is, I think, the dress that she won a gold medal for at the exhibition of handcrafts in Paris. And I think that she's posing as Penelope. I think that she has a very particular image of Penelope that she's posing after in that picture. So yes.
And Theodora Patrona asks, I am wondering what was the most interesting piece of information you discovered about Angelos Sikelianos, seen through Eva's eyes?
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty tricky to research him because it's hard. It's even more hard to get into his materials, you know. So I had to ask for very special permission, and I had very, very small amounts of time to look at materials that were in his archive. And I think that we don't know him in the same way that we don't, you know, he's a mythologized figure, and even more so because he's a literary legend. I was very, very happy to see Chartis do a special issue on his work, and to read the work of very younger poets and younger writers who are reconnecting with it, because it was feeling alienating to people for a long time. So I mean, the one bit of his history that I spent time looking at was the circulation of the Kritika during the occupation by the Germans, and of course that, you know, you were not allowed to print anything that was considered to be resistance material. So he had it rewritten and copied by hand, and then and I don't know how it circulated, but a copy of that got out of the country and ended up in Switzerland, and then it ended up in Cairo, and then it ends up, you know, and then Seferis got his hands on it and he sent it to Eva Sikelianos. So that, I think, is just an incredibly interesting chapter, and in both of their history, and a point of connection. And I think so. I'll just stay with that. He's somebody who needs more research.
Okay, so maybe we have time for just one more question, if that's okay with everybody. Jane Cohen says, thank you, Artemis. I was really fascinated by your discussion of your methods and decisions about how to organize your material through a number of broad themes, and also how you position your work in the feminist theorization about biographies. I am very inspired by this, but I am currently working on the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom and their involvement with Balkan, including Greek feminists in the interwar period. Was Eva involved in any of these kinds of peace, internationalist, feminist movements?
I mean, that's a very, very important question. And it's, you know, interesting to know that Eva Sikelianos' mother was a suffragist, and that during her time in the Sapphic circle, she and her mother were very much at odds, and she had nothing to do with the suffragist movement. She wasn't against it, but she wasn't connected with it. And, you know, I don't think that she ever identified herself as a feminist or with feminist movements. I think that, you know, her work was very aesthetic and very involved in the arts, and then she had this obsession with maintaining traditions for reasons that are articulated and easy to respect. But this meant that she was much more focused on sort of the whole question of transmission, and less focused on breaking the lines of transmission in order to change society. So Jane, thank you for the question. And really her political engagement begins during, you know, like in the last year of World War II and immediately after.
So I'd like to thank you as well, and to say that I think it's just really important, you know, from the questions that we're also seeing from the audience, to have somebody, you know, bring the life of Eva Palmer Sikelianos to everybody, and to make it accessible, right, in the way that you have made it accessible, because I think it's really difficult, you know, for anybody to just, you know, research and find out more about it. So I think that, you know, a book like yours really, you know, spreads awareness and provides, you know, accessibility to everyone in a way that I think is particularly useful. And, you know, we get to see, you know, we get to learn about women who, were deeply involved in all of these different ways, with Greece. As you said, she was very involved with the arts, with aesthetics, with writing, but also with politics, right? So it's really important to get this multi sort of dimensional aspect and understand better sort of her life. So I really want to thank you myself. And I know that Mr. Philaktopoulos wants to say a few words as closing.
Yeah, well, all I want to say is thank you, Artemis, and thank you, Nina, for a very, very interesting inside view on a fascinating woman and on her life during her pre-Sikelianos days and her post-Sikelianos days, and also on the art of biographical research. Artemis, you gave us some lessons here. I was amazed by the strange phenomenon of material on Eva parked in the Center for Asia Minor Studies. I mean, it's kind of an interesting point. Anyway, it's so lovely to see in this pre-holiday gathering so many familiar faces on this screen. On purpose, we keep it like this instead of making it a webinar where we cannot see anybody, so that we know who, and stay in touch with even in this fashion with our friends, alumni, former professors from other institutions, friends, trustees, and generally people interested in athletic studies and in CYA. With these words, I want to say goodbye and wish you all happy holidays ahead. And we will meet again right after the holidays, sometime in January. Thank you all. Good night.